Guys, today I want to talk about something that honestly it might be a little bit difficult to talk about. I want to discuss an epidemic that affects nearly every single person in this room. All of us know someone who's been affected by it, or honestly, some of us may even be affected by it ourselves. Guys, it's so pervasive that it impacts nearly 80% of all women and over 40% of all men. It's literally everywhere. The epidemic that I'm referring to is a distorted and broken view of ourselves and our bodies. Now, maybe this isn't what you expected to hear when you came to church today. And maybe this isn't a topic that you ever thought that would be addressed at church, because this doesn't sound like a really churchy thing. Maybe right now in your seats, right where you're sitting, you are starting to feel uncomfortable. You're starting to get a little bit nervous about what I'm going to talk about, or why I'm going to say it, or even what I'm going to say. And if that's you, I want to try to just calm your fears for just a moment. You see, first and foremost, I want you to understand that we and our bodies really matter to God. They really do. So often in church, we focus almost exclusively on our minds. We talk about things that we should believe or things that we should think. We also tend to focus a lot in church on how we should act, right? We talk about the fact that we're supposed to really kind of live on mission with Jesus, that we're supposed to engage the world around us. And don't get me wrong, those are really good things. Right? Those are things that we should talk about in church. There's nothing wrong with talking about those things. But the one thing that we typically overlook, and I don't want us to do right now, is the fact that our physical bodies are also incredibly important to God. And just as important as that is, how you view yourself, how you view your body, and where you find your identity, that is also incredibly important to God. Now, the second reason that I want to talk about this today is because, like I said, it affects nearly all of us, right? All of us in some way or another, we or people that we love are impacted by this problem, and we struggle with a distorted view of ourselves. And guys, if you really stop and think about it for a moment, there is so much disinformation out there about this topic, isn't there? I want you to just think about it for a minute. We've been led to believe that a distorted view of self is something that only teenage girls deal with. We've been led to believe that it's something that we'll eventually grow out of. We've been convinced by our culture that the way that we look, our appearance, that is what really defines us, right? Our appearance is what actually gives us our value. And that's why, as Americans, we spend over $1.5 trillion every year on all things wellness related. Guys, we're surrounded by a cultural narrative that's obsessed. It's obsessed with our bodies. We curate them, we organize them, we optimize them, we filter them, and then we relentlessly measure them. Right? We celebrate some body types, we shame others, and we spend an enormous amount of time and energy and money trying to enhance and fix and conceal the things that we think of as flaws. Guys, the truth is that we work so hard to look a certain way, don't we? I mean, think about all the things that we do so that we can obtain a particular kind of look. We use foundation and concealer and blush and eyeshadow and lip liner and hair dye and anti-aging cream, right? We obsess with the things that we put into our bodies. We obsess with what we eat on a daily basis. We even try to fix ourselves with surgeries, right? We have these surgeries so that we can look a particular way, so that we can accomplish a particular kind of look. And guys, I want you to understand something right now. I want to be super clear from the very beginning. You see, I'm not trying to shame anybody here today. I'm not trying to shame any person that's watching this sermon. You see, in fact, quite the opposite. I want you to understand that I am a fellow sufferer in this epidemic. You see, for as long as I can remember, my whole life I've struggled with how I view my body. I can tell you that with complete integrity that there has never been a moment in my life where I looked in the mirror and saw anything other than that overweight little kid that I was in elementary school. You see, I also have this problem. Guys, I want you to understand that our distorted image, our distorted view of our bodies, it's not just a side issue in our culture. It's not something that only affects one gender, one age group, or one body type. It's literally everywhere, and it really matters. And the reason that this matters is so much is because how we view ourselves is central to understanding our identity, our worth, and our value. Guys, the truth is that our culture has turned our bodies into cruel images, to cruel idols, where we measure our worth by our appearance, but God tells us a different story. You see, God tells us his truth, and that is that our bodies aren't commodities to perfect or prisons to escape. Instead, they're God's masterpiece in creation. Now, guys, as you can probably tell, today we're starting a brand new series called Broken Image. And this series, I think, is going to be really powerful because we focus on some important truths. One of the things that we're focusing on in this series is the fact that we all wrestle with some questions in our lives. We wrestle with questions about who we are, about what we're worth, and about where we belong, especially in a world that tells us over and over and over again that we're not enough. Right? A world that tells us that we're somehow deficient in ourselves. And so throughout this series, we're going to explore how God wants to meet us in our brokenness, how he can restore what's been distorted, and how he redefines our identity through his love. And guys, my prayer is that through this series that each and every one of us will gain a new understanding, a better understanding of our true identity and begin to see ourselves the way that God sees us, as whole and chosen and deeply loved. Now, to understand where this cultural obsession comes from, right, to understand this obsession that we have with the way we look in our bodies, we really need to take a step back and try to figure out where this idea that our value is found in our appearance, where does that even come from? Because I think for most of us, I think when we think about this issue, we think it's a really modern issue, right? We think of social media and the impact that social media has had on how we view ourselves and compare ourselves to one another. And so we might think that this is a really modern phenomenon. But if that's what we think, we would be completely wrong, right? We'd be totally off base. All the way back to ancient Egypt. You can see that this obsession with how a person looks, it isn't new. It's been around for thousands, literally thousands of years. And so since this isn't a new problem, we need to find a way to redefine our self-perception that stands the test of time. And to do that, I want to go all the way back to the very beginning. All the way back to the very beginning of time. The Old Testament book of Genesis. Right, the very first book of the Bible. In that book, we read about creation, right? We get this glimpse of what happens during creation. And what we find is that each day of creation, God creates something. He creates the light and the day and the sky and the animals and all these things. And in the middle of all of God's creating, we read this really interesting line. It says, then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, guys, the word that I want to focus on here is the word image. Now, in the Old Testament world, the word image is usually used to reference a statue or an idol of a particular god. In fact, it was widely believed that a God spirit dwelled inside of a statue or an idol that bore that God's image, right? So it wasn't this like ethereal concept. It wasn't like the essence of the God was in that thing. They actually believed that the God himself actually dwelled inside the statue or the image, right? Inside of that idol. And so what this means practically was that for whatever statue or idol is used, because it carried the image of the God that it represented, it could actually function as a sort of surrogate of that God wherever it was placed. So I want you to think, when God says that he created humans, you and I, in his own image, what it's saying in a way is that we serve as surrogates for God in the world. Now think about that for a minute. Think about that, what that means for you and for me. Think about what it means for every human, right? We are made in the image of God. We carry his image. We represent him to the world around us. And guys, what that should tell us is that every human carries innate value. Because we're made in the image and likeness of our Creator. We're made in the image of God. We're his image bearers. We're made in the image of God, and we serve as the image of God. And what this tells us is that our bodies are a gift. Now, I know what you might be thinking right now. Maybe for you, you really want to believe that your body's a gift. Right? You really want to believe. It's a great sentiment. Right? It's something that you wish that you believe, but if you're really honest with yourself, you don't always feel like your body's a gift. Maybe for you, you don't like what you see in the mirror every day. Maybe for you, you're getting older and it feels like your body is betraying you, not working the way it once did. Or maybe for you, you're trying so hard to meet some unrealistic social media kind of physical expectation that you just feel like your body is anything but a gift. But guys, when we feel this way, when we start to believe that, what we need to understand is that we're choosing to believe a cultural narrative that just isn't true. You see, when our identity and our worth becomes grounded in our appearance, then our body becomes a tyrant rather than a gift. And guys, whenever that happens, whenever we start to feel that way, we have to stop. We have to stop for just a moment and remind ourselves of God's truth. Remind ourselves that our bodies aren't commodities to perfect or prisons to escape. They are God's masterpiece. Now, I want to take a moment and be super clear about something here. You see, I believe that this focus on our bodies, I think it actually comes from a good place. It's just gotten distorted over time. You see, I'm convinced that our culture's fixation on physical health and strength and appearance, I believe that actually reflects a deeper intuition. See, that longing to feel whole and healthy and at peace in our own skins, it points to the truth that our bodies were meant to flourish under God's care. And so in that sense, our desire for health and bodily well-being, it actually echoes our creation. Right? So it's not a bad thing in and of itself, but the problem comes when we allow our appearance to determine our own self-worth. Now, another way that we can allow God to redefine our identity is found in the Old Testament book of 1 Samuel. Now, Samuel was a very powerful prophet in the Old Testament. In fact, God spoke through Samuel a lot to lead the nation of Israel. And that kind of climaxes when God has Samuel anoint the very first king of Israel, a guy named Saul. Now, Saul starts off as a pretty decent guy, a pretty decent king, but over time, he becomes really arrogant. And he starts to kind of stray away from God and where God's trying to take the people. And so God finally has enough. He decides that he's done with Saul. He's done with Saul being king. And his time is over. And God decides that he's going to place a new leader in charge of the nation of Israel. And so God tells Samuel that he needs to go to the house of a guy named Jesse, because one of Jesse's sons is going to be the new king. He's going to be the new leader. And so as you can imagine, Jesse was pretty pumped to hear that one of his sons was going to be the future king of Israel. And so he does what most of the parents, most of the fathers at this time would have done. He goes and finds his oldest son, right, this physically imposing man, and he brings him out to Samuel to present him to Samuel. His name is Eliab. Now, it's important for you to know that people at this time, they would have expected a king to be physically powerful, physically intimidating, like a warrior king. That was really the archetype of a leader in this day. That's who they would have expected to be leading. And so when Samuel sees Eliab, he thinks the same thing, right? He looks at this imposing man and he goes, oh, yeah, this has got to be him, right? This has to be the king. He looks like a king. This has got to be the guy. But guys, God has other plans. Listen to what it says. God says, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, guys, if we were to keep reading, we would find out that not only does God reject Eliab, but Jesse brings out all of his sons. He parades all of them out before Samuel, thinking, well, this one's got to be it. This one's got to be it every time. And each and every time, God rejects that son. It gets so awkward, in fact, that at one point, Samuel's sitting there going, hey, is there anybody else in the house? Right? Like, you got any friends next door? Some of you could bring over? Like, who else is here? And so what happens is that Jesse finally brings out his unlucky eighth son, this guy that's been out in the field tending sheep because nobody thought this dude would ever amount to anything, right? Nobody thought this guy would ever be king. He brings him inside. His name is David. You see, no one, not even David's own father, looked at him and saw the potential of a king, but God did. You see, God saw his heart. He saw who he would become. And so God chooses him to be king, and not just any king, but one of the most powerful and influential kings in all of Israel's history. Now, guys, what this shows us is that God sees the heart, not just the surface. You see, God isn't concerned with how other people view us. He's not concerned with what our culture tells us is beautiful or attractive or valuable. Instead, God cares about what's in our hearts. He cares about who we are on the inside. And guys, what we need to do as followers of Jesus, we need to choose to let that reality redefine where we find our value. Instead of believing that our value lies in how we look, we need to ground ourselves in the truth that each of us is made in the image of God and therefore incredibly valuable. And we also need to embrace the truth that God cares about what's in our hearts far more than he cares about how we look on the outside. Now, the final way that we can allow God to redefine our identity is found in the New Testament in the book of 1 Timothy. Now, 1 Timothy was written by the Apostle Paul, and he wrote it to one of his apprentices, a guy named Timothy. And Paul writes this letter, this book, for a couple different reasons. The one reason is because he's trying to fight against some of his opponents and their teaching. Right? Paul's trying to kind of put together some theological reasons why they're wrong, and he's right. But another reason why Paul writes this letter is because he wants to encourage Timothy. He wants to encourage him in his ministry and his work. He wants to kind of put some wind behind the man's sails. And in the middle of all of Paul's encouragement, listen to what he tells Timothy. He says, train yourself to be godly. For physical training is of some value, but godliness has value for all things, holding promise for both the present life and the life to come. Now, guys, what I want to focus on here is the imagery, that athletic imagery that Paul uses. You see, Paul tells Timothy to train himself for godliness. Then he says that physical training, it has some value, but godliness is really the most important thing. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what did Paul mean when he said godliness? Right? Like what does that mean when he says godliness? What was in Paul's mind when he used that word? Well, you see, for a lot of us here today, in our culture, when we think of godliness, we think of something like maybe moral perfection, right? We think of a list of do's and don'ts, and godliness is where we spend more time on the do side of the list and less time on the don't side of the list, right? That's what we think of when we think of godliness. But the truth is, that's not actually what Paul was talking about when he used this word. You see, back in Paul's time, in the original language, this word godliness was really a broad term that applied more to a person's entire character. And so Paul says that a person's character should be reflected in a life that's aligned with God's character. Now, think about that. One of the things I find so interesting here is that Paul draws this really clear contrast between character training and our culture's obsession with surface training. You see, guys, what Paul's trying to help us understand is that we need to focus on our whole self. Paul tells us that both kinds of training are important. Yes, physical training, physical exercise, it's important to sustaining life. It's important for our own personal health and well-being. But spiritual training, spiritual development is a far more precious, far more enduring, and far more important thing in our lives. So guys, the question that we have to answer for ourselves today is, what are we supposed to do with this? Like, what are we supposed to do with all of this information that we have? I mean, yes, we're supposed to ground ourselves in the truth that each of us is made in the image of God and are therefore incredibly valuable. We need to embrace the reality that God's much more concerned about who we are on the inside than how we look on the outside. But practically speaking, how does that make any impact on the way that we live? Well, guys, listen, the truth is that our culture is caught in this really complicated tension around our bodies. On the one hand, we're rightly concerned about health, right? I mean, think about it for a moment. Obesity is a serious problem. Chronic disease is widespread. And so cultivating a strong and resilient body, it really is a worthy goal. So pursuing health through things like good nutrition, regular exercise and rest, it's not only practical, it's also morally responsible. Because our bodies are the instruments through which we live and work and serve God. But on the other hand, our culture also constantly bombards us with ideals of perfection. It constantly bombards us with these slim and toned and flawless bodies that are often unattainable without extreme measures or digital alteration. Guys, the problem is that the pursuit of health and the pursuit of appearance, they've become entangled. They've become so intertwined that it's easy now for us to just confuse the two things. It's hard for us to differentiate between the two, and so we end up holding ourselves up against something that we were never supposed to hold ourselves up to. Guys, listen, the key to all of this is that we need to affirm two important truths. Yes, we should pursue health because our bodies really matter to God. But no, we should not idealize perfection as a measure of worth. Instead of believing our culture's lies about where our value comes from, instead of believing the lies about where we find our identity, we of our vanity. And then once we've done that, we need to embrace God's truth. The truth that our bodies aren't commodities to perfect or prisons to escape. They are his masterpiece in this world. And then after we do that, guys, we could take some concrete steps to begin pushing back against that false cultural narrative. We can take some concrete steps to kind of dig in and not allow our culture to dictate how we see ourselves any longer. And the thing is, there's a ton of different ways that we can do this. There's a ton of ways that we can push back. I'm going to give you just a few examples today, but really I'm giving you these examples so that it can kind of spark your imagination. Right? So that you can think for yourself how best to push back against the false cultural narrative. Now, maybe for you, here's one idea. Maybe you could try a season where you limit your daily mirror usage. Now, listen, I know this sounds crazy, but hear me out, okay? Hear me out. I actually read an article about our obsession with looking in the mirror. They call it self-surveillance. And what we're doing when we're constantly checking ourselves in the mirror is we're constantly evaluating, constantly criticizing, constantly nitpicking ourselves over and over and over again, trying to accomplish some unrealistic ideal. Now, maybe that's not you. Maybe what might be helpful for you is to simply just stop using filters on your selfies. Seriously. I mean, think about it. What would it be like if you let the world see the true and beautiful you that you are? Not filtered, not AI kind of brushed up, but just you. Just you. And here's another idea. Maybe we should curb our social media usage so that we can push back against that comparison game that we're constantly stuck in. That comparison game that keeps telling us that we don't look like some unrealistic ideal. Maybe that's what we need to do. Or maybe for you, it really comes down to taking a break from those calorie counting apps. Right? Like taking a break from constantly checking yourself over and over and over and obsessing about what you're putting in your body, and instead just thank God for the provision that he's given you. Just thank God for the food that you have to eat and enjoy his creation. Guys, listen, I don't know what's right for you. I don't know which of these things will help you begin to embrace the reality of how God sees you, but I do know this. Guys, we need to bring our shame and our confusion to the feet of Jesus. Because at his feet, that's where we will discover that his broken body redefines our own. Listen, Pope John Paul II once wrote that the body, and only the body, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and divine. It has been created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden from eternity in God, and thus to be a sign of it. Now let me tell you what he means. What he's saying here is that our bodies make the invisible God visible in the world around us. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. Think about the fact that your body makes God visible on this planet. And then ask yourself, how could we possibly believe that our value and our identity is tied up in how we look? How could we possibly let the culture tell us what's beautiful and what's not, what we should look like and what we shouldn't? How could we possibly do that when our own bodies make the invisible God visible on this planet? It's crazy. And guys, the King David, the king that we were talking about a little while ago, in Psalm 139, he agrees with this idea when he says that each and every one of us is fearfully and wonderfully made. Listen, guys, you are an image bearer of God. You're his reflection in this world. You are his representative. You are God's masterpiece. So let's set aside the lies that our culture wants us to believe. Let's set aside the lies that tell us that we are only as valuable as our appearance would suggest. And instead, let's begin to embrace the truth of God. That you are made in the image of the Creator. And that you are so valuable. Pray with me. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for choosing to make us in your own image, in your likeness. God, for so many of us, we wrestle, we struggle with how we view ourselves. We struggle with what we see when we look in the mirror. We struggle with comparing ourselves to some unrealistic expectations. And God, I just pray right now for freedom from that. For each and every person in this room that's watching this sermon, God, give us freedom from these unrealistic ideals, from this distorted image of ourselves. And Father, help us to embrace your truth. We're made in your image. We're your masterpiece. Jesus, thank you so much for loving us. In his name we pray.